This is the heliosblog reporting live from an underground bunker somewhere in the West. Welcome. Today, Jordan Peterson discusses communism in all its glory. Yes, totally. This should be great.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
That's the kind of thing where I think Americans don't realize how...
Well, we have this delusion in the West that in a totalitarian society, it's like the freedom-loving mass.
Yes.
And there's like this oppressive guy, the tyrant, or an oppressive guy with his henchmen putting guns to people's heads all the time. And that's nothing could be farther from the truth than that. It's like, I figured that out in part just when I was reading the Gulag Archipelago, because Solzhenitsyn kept making the case that there were nowhere near enough guards to keep the camps running. The prisoners ran the camps. And it's like, well, that's the definition of a totalitarian state.
The prisoners run the camps. So in order for something to be totalitarian, you have to agree. You have to agree to follow it.
The prisoners run the camp. And in a totalitarian state, and this is what a totalitarian state is, it's not the top-down imposition of power. It's the fact that every single person in the society lies about absolutely everything to everyone all the time. I was reading the book of Abraham, and in that book, God is deciding he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they've wandered off the moral path. Okay, and so the implication there is that a society can adopt modes of being that dooms them to catastrophe.
Yep, that describes communism perfectly, but also womanism and wokeism, I would say, which is cultural Marxism.
All right, and we're talking about exactly how it might come about.
Or at least it includes elements of cultural Marxism.
Abraham is concerned about this because he thinks, well, it doesn't seem fair to obliterate the whole city when there might be innocent people still dwelling in it. And so Abraham says to God, if there's 40 people there, if I can go there and I can find 40 God-fearing, honest people, will you suspend the destruction of the city? And God says yes, and Abraham bargains again to 30, and I think he gets God down to like 10.
Can I interject?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
There's a part of this story that isn't commonly known. They taught us this when I was a kid in yeshiva, and I think the number that starts with a 50, and then Abraham says, how about, double check the numbers at home.
Yeah.
And Abraham goes, how about 5 less? And God's like, okay. But what Abraham meant was 50, and you crossed out the 5, 0. So he's really like, all right, look, I know there's no hope for this town, but if there's even 0 righteous people, let's not kill them all.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can understand that. And you can also, people have ambiguity about the morality of God as presented in the Old Testament because these destructive waves come. But to me, that's a reflection of the fact that there are modes of being that will lead to catastrophe. But the implication of the story seems to me to be quite clear, which is that in any society, even if it's become extraordinarily deviant, if there's even a handful of people who don't lie, that's enough to turn the tide or stem the flow, right? Because it means that the grip of hell has become, it's not complete enough yet so that all hope whatsoever has been vanquished. And I think it was...
Indeed. So, so long as there's a group of people so heroism, if there's a group of heroes, effectively, you can save the society. That's what Jordan is talking about. Again, it's one of the reasons why I started this YouTube channel. Not to say that I'm a hero. I'm just a humble guy trying to make some money. But, you know, I couldn't stand by and watch as womanist, wokist, indoctrination garbage spread through society. So, again, and should I not be paid for spending hours and hours talking about it? I think I should. You see? So.
Solzhenitsyn, who said that one man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny, and that's. But what that also implies, and this is a very perverse thing too, is that the people who are in a totalitarian state are complicit in it every time they agree to participate in the lie. And, you know, you might say, well, they had to because there was a gun to their head. But the thing is, there is a gun to their head anyways, right? I mean, and I think that's the same when we face moral conundrums in our current society. I saw university faculty back away from the administration onslaught over the course of decades, never willing to stand up and say, okay, I actually think that you guys are pushing farther than I'm willing to go. And the rationales were always the same. It's like, I will be punished unduly for my objection. But the consequence of that is that you're certainly punished for your silence, right? You might escape that immediate catastrophe, although probably not, because I don't think anybody escaped anything in the Soviet Union. But the long-term consequences of abiding by the lie are, well, it's hell as far as I can tell.
Well, a few things. First of all, you're not going to find anyone more contemptuous of academics than myself, present company excluded. So to find that they are universally weak is not at all a surprise.
Savage.
But to your other point, one of the reasons I did write this book was because I am so hopeful about the future. And one of the counters to that, people are like, how can you be hopeful? We don't have the numbers. We're not going to have the numbers. And one of the things, as you just pointed out, is we don't...
Most people are cowards. They're not willing to even half stand against the tide.
We don't need a majority. We just need an alternative. If you do have this small cadre of people who refuse to give in to the lie, who demonstrate there is another chance than the path that we're currently on, that is so much more powerful and punches so much more above its weight than, you know, a lot of people who are simply ballast and are simply going to go with what the majority decree or the zeitgeist happens to be at the moment. And we saw this over and over in the countries of Eastern Europe that self-liberated. They did not have the numbers in terms of organization. They couldn't have, or else they would have been slaughtered as a whole. But Poland, you know, specifically with Solidarity, this labor movement, which brought down first the Polish government and then, you know, was a domino that kind of toppled the Soviet Empire. It was not a huge percentage of the population. And these men suffered, you know, immense hardships and duress, but they stuck through it enough that they managed to win. So I think the issue with people like Solzhenitsyn and Conquest is those books and the Black Book Communism. You finish those books, you want to put a bullet to your head. And what I want to do here is you've only written 80% of the story, because the point is despite what we were told in the West for decades, that the Soviet Union is perpetual, we have to learn to live together, they're not going anywhere. We tried it with the Korean War, we tried it with the Vietnam War, you know, we have détente. There was a time in our lifetimes when criticizing the Soviet Union was regarded explicitly as inching us closer to nuclear war, because they regard it as a provocation. Look, you can't antagonize them. We just got to figure out how to work together. And at a certain point, both Reagan and Thatcher Reagan said, do you want to know what my policy is for the Cold War? It's simple. Some might even call it simplistic. You want to hear it? We win and they lose. And he was correct. But his entire presidency, despite him refusing secretly to retaliate if the Russians struck him with nuclear weapons, was this commitment to I will not have this power of the presidency and abide the continuing existence of this absolutely satanic evil empire.
Sorry, we're going to skip this.
And so, what do we do about China?
Yeah, so you got to stand against the tide. You got to be brave to do so.
Listen, no, I don't know what we do about China. Let's stick to what they're gonna do.
No. Well, I guess
certainly, I'll tell you what we do about China. We certainly don't valorize them. We don't regard them as a decent state that should.
We don't use them as a model for emulation during pandemics.
Disaster.
We criticize and I think expose their tactics and machinations internally, externally, as much as possible. But the corporate press is very interested, for reasons that I'm not in a position necessarily to opine on, to downplay as many Chinese atrocities and even just Chinese standard operating procedure as much as possible.
Yeah, which means what? They're either bought or they agree, or I don't know. What is it? Appeasement? That never works, historically speaking.
Yeah, well, everyone was hoping for a good amount of time that if China was pulled into the modern Western economy, that one of the consequences of that would be a turn towards something approximating individual freedom, like a an incremental democratization. And there was a few years where that looked like a real possibility. I mean, China lifted itself, I shouldn't say that, as a consequence of abandoning its stupider policies. China managed to free its people enough so that they lifted themselves out of poverty. And then for a while it looked promising, right? And then,
now disaster with the social point system garbage.
And then they installed 700 million closed circuit television cameras and built the world's most total surveillance state. You know, the name of that system is the same name. It's the same name as the system that goes astray in the Terminator series.
Skynet?
Skynet.
No.
You can't make this crap up. What is this?
100%. They called it Skynet. And the engineers who built it said, we're building the good Skynet. This is actually true. Yeah. I know, it's impossible to believe.
Wow. Okay.
Disaster.
No kidding. It's like, well, they're the techno Luciferian technologists who think, oh, this time we'll get
the true communism,
surveillance state 100% right.
But they are getting it right. It's insofar as it serves their purposes.
Yeah. Well, yes, and it's drifting quite rapidly into the West as well. You know, more and more you go through. Like I was in the store the other day that had the ability where you could pay with your palm. Right, we're getting very close to the Face ID payment systems, and everybody thinks, well, isn't that convenient? It's like,
no.
Yeah, it's convenient until the centralized databases know absolutely every goddamn thing you're doing every second. Then they can start putting on differential tax that's calculated according to your hypothetical carbon load or something like that. And that's
very
a high
bad
probability outcome as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm not pessimistic. I think I share your fundamental optimism, but boy, the slippery slope slide is sitting there right in front of us, and we could take a trip down.
I don't think it's a slippery slope at all. I think it's an elevator shaft.
Yeah, well,
yeah, I mean, like it's really just like
that's just the ultimate and slippery.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an elevator shaft that's bottomless.
But I think the other thing I think a lot of people don't appreciate is to what extent people are. Again, this is something that the Enlightenment I think gets wrong. Mencken, who's one of my great role models, he's a journalist from the early 20th century. He said, the average man does not want to be free. He merely wants to be safe. So this isn't being done with, gun to head. These are people tripping over themselves because they would rather be convenient because they compete on the metric of obedience. So if it's like, I'll just do whatever I'm told as long as I don't have to worry about anything, what do I care if you keep track of where I go, what I buy, what I consume? Nothing I'm consuming is outside the median, the bell curve. Nothing where I go is unusual at all. Doesn't cost me anything, and I get taken care of. I get to be a pet of those in power.
There's nothing I find more terrifying than this, than reducing everyone to an average sheep. That's very dystopian and scary.
You can understand from their perspective. This is a great market for them.
Yeah, well, the cost is that if you give up all the difficulties of your life, let's say, because you're looking for difficulties and danger of life because you're looking for security and satiation, then you don't have anything interesting or meaningful to do. And so there is no pathway to happiness that's merely a consequence of security and satiation.
But don't you think it's a brave new world situation where people are perfectly comfortable just living a life of mild pleasure, not in like an orgiastic kind of way, but rather than seeking any sort of happiness which is beyond their means?
I don't know, because I don't think it actually works for people.
Well, I don't think they don't have the presence of mind to realize that. They're living more moment to moment. They're not having this kind of long-term strategy of
disaster. But that's accurate. That is accurate. Most people don't think beyond their nose. They don't think what's over the horizon. It's true. Again, as I said, like sheep. What is my moment-to-moment need? That's it. There is no long-term strategy.
A look at their own lives.
Right. The chickens probably come home to roost in times of existential crisis.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And that's when people do some soul searching and perhaps decide that what it is that they've been satisfying themselves with is insufficient.
Yes.
And then there's an opportunity for transformation.
But not always taken.
Oh, well, it's also well, okay, let's talk about that a little bit, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is I don't know to what degree you would still ally yourself with the anarchist movement, and I want to know, well, to what degree you do, and also I would like to know what that means. You open your book with Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
And I know that's a bit of a tangential intrusion into that question, but she's definitely an arbiter or a spokeswoman for an individualistic stance. So
Yes,
I want to talk to you about Ayn Rand, because I have some ideas about that that I want. But I'm also curious. You obviously regard a focus on the individual as the appropriate medication against this kind of statist, intellectual, Luciferian utopianism, and I think that's appropriate. But I want to know what your vision of an alternative is, and why you adopted that particular vision.
Well, I don't know that I have a vision per se. I'm not a central planner.
Right.
But what anarchism means to me, and I do 100% regard myself as an anarchism, is it is an approach to life. It is an approach to treating people peacefully. It is a recognition that political authority is inherently illegitimate, although sometimes it is powerful. And it is regarding our existence as an amazing opportunity, and to live life to its fullest, and to realize that to take that away from somebody else is a huge, moral outrage. So that is kind of what anarchism means to me.
Okay.
And Rand was asked at one point, she goes, if I had to sum up my worldview, or whatever term she used, in one word, it would be this: individualism. So yes, that is exactly.
Yeah, so that's where, okay. Yes. So let me delve into that a little
But it's also just important because, Berkman and Goldman, there's this boomer idea that more government is left-wing and less government is right-wing, and it puts Goldman and Berkman on the right wing. It's just this weird thing because they want Hitler to be a leftist because their right wing is good, Hitler's bad, Hitler's a leftist, that kind of mindset. Point being, it's very important for me to give credit the fact that the first critics of the Soviet Union with firsthand experience were hardcore, unmitigated lefties. Emma Goldman and Berkman were both bloodthirsty, happy to slit throats, but they're saying we're doing this in the sake of revolution to kind of bring about a society that works for everyone, not against the workers themselves that we are championing. This is not what we're for. So they weren't, kind of this pansy type of lefties. They were, but Emma Goldman gave a talk in Union Square, and she told the audience, she goes, go to the capitalists and ask for work. And if they don't give you work, ask for bread. And if they don't give you bread, take bread. So she's like, you do not have a moral obligation to starve. So they had this contemptuous, why are people starving when there's millionaires out there, was their mindset. So the fact that these people, at great cost to themselves and to their status in this kind of workers' movement, were so vocal about denouncing what they had seen firsthand and were called puppets of the capitalists.
So why do you think that's important? I mean, you spend a lot of time on Berkman and Goldman. Have I got the first name
Yes,
right?
Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman.
Yeah, right. Okay. You spend a lot of time on them, and you do show that they were, as representatives of the autonomous worker, let's say, they were appalled by what they saw in the Soviet Union. And you seem to be making the case that that's important because of their stress on individualism, or because you also wanted not to fall prey to the delusion that it was only the right that was standing against.
Exactly. I hate this idea that right good, left bad, or vice versa.
Yeah, well, the whole purpose of having right versus left is what? Is to keep the people divided, because divide and conquer. That's as old as Julius Caesar. It's only 2,000 years old, guys. Arguably older, because something similar is in The Art of War by Sun Tzu, but...
There were the fight against totalitarianism was a series of dots that are often...
Wait, is Sun Tzu older than the Roman Empire? I could be wrong about this, because I remember hearing Mongolians referencing The Art of War. Anyway, you guys can tell me in the comments. I could be wrong about the timeline. Perhaps Julius Caesar is older.
Completely counterintuitive. And I think it's very important historically when people fight, these individuals who fight against this kind of atrocities, that they give the credit that they're due.
Okay, so you're looking at something like attempting to replace the right-wing versus the terrible communists narrative with something more like people who are concerned with the individual against the collective. Okay, fine. I see. Okay, so now I reread Ayn Rand's books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
I think this is the third time I read both of them, and I read them within the last couple of months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was, now and then I'm looking for a romantic read, maybe. that's somewhat intellectually challenging, and now and then I'll pick up one of her books. And she's a curious figure to me because Ayn Rand had every reason to despise the Soviet Union and was a very good counter voice to their machinations. Well, and you know, I got introduced to her books. It was quite interesting. So I worked for the socialists when I was like 14 till I was 16 before I figured out that
it's stupid.
I didn't know enough to presume that the way I wanted to arrange the world in a utopian fashion was credible. And I figured that out by the time I was about 17. I thought, oh, well, what do you know? You don't have a job. I had little jobs, you know. You don't have a business. You don't have a family. You don't have any education. It's like, what the hell do you know? Really? Right. So, okay. Anyways,
Smart.
The person who gave me Ayn Rand's books was this woman, Sandy Notley. She was the mother of one of Alberta's recent premiers, a socialist premier, and she was the wife of the only elected socialist official in Alberta when I grew up. And I asked her what she gave me, Solzhenitsyn and Huxley and Orwell. Like, she was an educated woman, and she gave me Ayn Rand's books, which I read when I was like 13. And you know, I found them compelling.
Yeah.
You know, they've got that, they're romantic adventures fundamentally, with an intellectual bent. And I liked the anti-collective ethos that was embedded in them. And then I've read them, like I said, a couple of times since then. So here's the problem I have, and you can help me sort this out. Like, I certainly agree with you that a society that isn't predicated on something like recognition of the intrinsic and superordinate worth of the individual is doomed to catastrophe. Right. And so, but here's the rub as far as I'm concerned, and this is what I really had a problem with, especially this time when I went through Rand's books. It's like John Galt, for example, and Francisco d'Anconia, who's the architect?
Howard Rourke.
Rourke. Her heroic capitalists, essentially. They're not precisely heroic capitalists. They're heroic individualists who compete in the free market. Okay, and that's fine. And you can see the libertarian side of that. And I'm also a free market advocate, and partly because I think that distributed decision-making is a much better computational model than centralized planning. Right. Obviously.
It's not obvious.
Right. Well, yeah, it should be.
Sure.
But it should be. It's not obvious to utopian Luciferian intellects, but it's obvious even if you just think about it from a computational perspective.
Well, I'll just say the smartest person is ignorant of 99.99% of knowledge.
Yes, exactly.
Indeed.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Is that precisely why you want it distributed. Okay, so that's partly what I want to go into. So now the Randian heroes identify themselves as fervent individualists, and you stop me as soon as I get any of this wrong or in some way you don't disagree with. They're pursuing their own selfish ethos.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so that's the rub to me, because I'm going to think about this psychologically and neurophysiologically. So just to make it complicated. Okay, so the first question would be, well, what exactly do you mean by the individual and the self? Okay, so when a child develops, let's say, when a child first emerges into the world, they're essentially a system of somewhat disconnected primary instinctual sub-personalities, right? And so they, with the nascent possibility of a uniting ego, identity, personality, something like a continuity of memory across time, but that has to emerge. Now, it seems to emerge as a consequence of neurophysiological development and experiential maturation. And so, you know, the child comes equipped into the world, say, with a sucking reflex, because its mouth and tongue are very wired up. So that's where the child is most conscious. That's why kids, when they can, put everything in their mouth, because they can feel it and investigate it far before they have control over their eyes or their arms, because their arms sort of float around. And so what happens is they're born as a set of somewhat independent systems. And then the independent systems, partly under the influence of social demand, integrate themselves.
Right.
Okay. Now, so, and then, like, by the time a child is 2, that child is still mostly disintegrated emotional systems. And so if you watch a 2-year-old, and I use 2 for a specific reason, what you see is that they cycle through basic motivational states. So a child is often, like a child whose demand-oriented motivational states are satiated will play, right? And play and explore. But then they get tired and they'll cry, or they'll get hungry and they'll cry, or they'll get angry and they'll have a tantrum, or, you know, or they'll burst into tears. Well, I said they'll cry, and or they'll get anxious, right? And so they're cycling through these primary motivational states. Now, we understand that to some degree neurophysiologically, because the older the brain system, the more likely it is to be operative in infancy, right? So like the rage system, or the system that mediates anxiety, or the system that mediates pain, those come into being pretty early, but it's hard for them to get integrated. Okay, now here's the problem. And I don't know how to distinguish individualism from hedonism, and I don't know how to distinguish hedonism from possession by one of these lower order motivational states. So when Rand says we should be able to pursue our own selfish needs, she's kind of taking a classic...
She doesn't say selfish needs, she says self-interest.
Okay, so fine. Okay, so that, no, well, no, I would say she moves between those two, because there are...
Never says needs, I'm positive.
Okay, she may never say needs.
She attacks that word all the time.
Okay, right, fair enough. Okay, so I'll back off on the needs side. That was ill-chosen, and she makes absolutely bloody sure. Well, wait a second.
She says now, your needs are not a blank check on my...
I know, yeah. but she doesn't, does she say simultaneously that I have no right to pursue my needs?
She doesn't use that word. She says you pursue your self-interest to the best of your abilities.
Okay, but she also uses the word selfish.
Yes.
Okay, so fine.
In a very idiosyncratic way.
Right, okay, right, absolutely. I would just want to make sure that we're proceeding on grounds that we both regard as appropriate. So the liberal types, the Scottish liberals, believe that if people were encouraged to pursue their self-interest, that would produce a self-regulating system. Now, Rand seems to accept that as a proposition. Yes?
Yes.
So if people are freely able to pursue their self-interest, then a system of free exchange will emerge out of that has the appropriate qualities of governance.
Yes, she says this explicitly on Donahue. She was asked, you're saying that if people pursued their own self-interest, there wouldn't be any oppression, there wouldn't be war, there wouldn't be any Hitler. Should they be less? And she goes, there wouldn't be any.
Yeah, well, look, when I'm negotiating with someone for a business deal, let's say, or, you know, when I'm trying to formulate a strategy that enables me to work happily together with someone over the long run, I'm hoping that they'll be thrilled with the deal. Like, sure. I'm not trying to win.
Of course.
I think, well, I would like to set you up in a situation so that you could pursue our mutual goals completely of your own accord. And then I don't even have to watch you, right? Because you're doing things for whatever reasons you have. But this is the thing. This is what I don't quite understand, is that self-interest. Okay, so it seems to me that for that self-interest to work, then it has to be a self-interest that's commensurate with the structure that would emerge if everyone was pursuing their self-interest simultaneously. You see what I mean?
Not everyone.
Well, okay. So let's say you and I make an arrangement, and it's a long-term arrangement, and at one point you decide that it's in your self-interest to violate that agreement because you can garner an intense short-term gain as a consequence.
But there's a long-term cost.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so
I've ruined this relationship, and also there's a long-term cost in terms of myself.
What's the cost?
The cost is I'm no longer a person of integrity. I'm not a man of my word. So Rand says, there's two Rand quotes where she goes, she says that man is a being of self-made soul. And she also says in The Fountainhead, which is about Howard Roark, the architect, that a building has integrity just like a man and just as seldom.
Indeed. Okay, sorry guys, I didn't really comment. I was entranced by the logic, and I didn't want to interrupt it. Okay. Yeah, let's end it there. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all for notifications. Drop me a donation like Hunter M, Adrian R, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, and Brian. Shout out to you, most recent Patreon subscriber. Thank you. My Patreon can be found at patreon.com/theheliosblog. Buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. If you're interested in coaching, message me at theheliosblog@gmail.com. And I'll slot you right in. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially if you listen to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.